Okay, I think we've got, whoop, still got some people filtering in. I'll give you guys another minute or so to jog your memories on this stuff before we draw out ourselves a nice little chart to make sure we're all on the same page. Okay, I'm going to pull up a screen, start making a couple notes about this question. Okay, so officially what we're looking at here are our Starling forces. And just a note here, unfortunately, you may have seen the word Starling forces before when we were talking about the heart. These are different Starling forces. The two actually aren't related. A little frustrating that they use the word twice, but when we're thinking about Starling forces for this part of the course, we're thinking about forces across capillaries. We'll actually be thinking about these in other systems as well, even past this first exam. This will come back when we start talking about the kidney. So it's good to make sure we have them down now. Okay. So when we're thinking about our Starling forces, they come in two types. Where's my arrow? Oh, that's just the mouse. Whoops. All right. Oh, I still have that on there. Great. Okay. So our Starling forces, we have two types, and then we're going to have each of these coming from the capillary and values for the interstitial fluid. So over here, to begin with, we have our hydrostatic forces. Okay. So those are anything that starts with P, right? So that's pressure from the capillary and pressure from the interstitial fluid. Subscripts are hard, but those would be subscripts, the cap and the IF. Okay. And essentially those hydrostatic forces act as a push from whichever location we're looking at, whether the push from the capillary or the push from the interstitial fluid. Okay. Unfortunately, all our words here are going to start with P, but if you want to associate the P with push, that may be helpful. So what we're thinking about when we're thinking about these hydrostatic forces is just the physical force of the fluid pressing on stuff. So if we were to draw a bottle, right? Oh boy, great drawing. Okay, so here's our bottle. Here we have it filled with some fluid. Okay, the hydrostatic forces would be the forces pushing out on the wall as a result of the fact that there's water with a volume, with a weight, pushing out in this region. So when we're looking at the capillary, gonna quick sketch our little capillary here, right? Have one end, our arteriolar end, we've got our venous end, okay? So our pressure, our hydrostatic pressure of the capillary is the force of the blood pushing on the walls of our capillary, okay? And our PIF, our pressure of the interstitial fluid. Here in yellow, we got our tissue. Just gonna write a T there because it's hard to write with a mouse, but our interstitial space, right? The space between the tissue and the blood here is filled with interstitial fluid overall. That's what we're talking about. And so it also has a pressure. And that pressure is in the opposite direction, right? Oop. So this is, it's not erasing. This is our PIF. Okay, so our pressure of the interstitial fluid is the pressure of that force pushing back in towards the capillary. So it's like pushing on this wall, but from the opposite direction. We'll talk about, we also have this question of filtration versus absorption. So why don't we make a little diagram and fill these in as we go. So here we go. So we're going to be thinking about forces for filtration. And we're going to be thinking about sources for, all right, got my text here, right? Absorption. Maybe I'll erase this ugly word and type for y'all. Okay, our forces for filtration here. And let's separate out these forces by the capillary and the interstitial fluid, just so we have a nice little grid. So in this first column, we'll put our capillary forces. In the second column, we're going to put our interstitial fluid forces. Okay. So now that we have those up, we want to add in whether each of these is a force for filtration or a force for or a force for absorption. Now, filtration means the movement of fluid from the capillary to the interstitial fluid. And absorption is movement from the interstitial fluid getting absorbed by the blood. Okay, so if we want to put on these two hydrostatic pressures here, right, we'd have pressure from the capillary. It's going to be a force for filtration, right? It's pushing fluid from the blood into the interstitial fluid. That's our filtration. When we look at our pressure from the interstitial fluid, you might remember that this is a very small force, but it does exist. So this pressure from the interstitial fluid, you can see our arrow goes the other way. All right, so I'll put it here. Our pressure for the interstitial fluid, that hydrostatic pressure, is pressing in, so that's absorption, a force for movement from the fluid in that interstitial space into the blood. Okay. Now we're going to do the right-hand side of this diagram. So in addition to hydrostatic forces, we have a total of 4 forces. So our hydrostatic forces, we also have the osmotic pressure. We'll see this referred to as colloid as well, because it's really due to proteins in each of these fluids. And this is exerting a pull on fluid, all right, because solutes, impermeable solutes, draw water towards them. Okay. So if we wanted to have our capillary, right, again, I'll leave it red. It's going to get even more simple. This is our capillary. This is our tissue. All right, so if we're thinking about the osmotic pressures, we're going to be thinking about the pressure caused by, first, proteins in the blood, right? So So we're going to have proteins in the blood, and there are impermeant solutes, so they can't cross those endothelial layers. So which direction is that force going to go? It's going to go this way, right? So we're going to have water being drawn towards those proteins, right? So that is our pi cap. So it's the pressure, the osmotic pressure, which is a pull caused by those proteins in the blood. Our interstitial fluid may have some impermeant solutes as well, right? Again, they're going to exert a pull, but now our pull is in the opposite direction. Right? Our pull is towards the interstitial fluid. So that is our pi IF. So those are our definitions of each of these. Now we want to put them on the filtration versus absorption spectrum. All right. So we're still just thinking about the directions of those arrows, right? So we can match them up, right? Because we have the pressure of the capillary, the pressure of the interstitial fluid. So now we're just going to look at those arrows, right? So whenever we have a pi, that's a pull being exerted on water by proteins. So the difference between those pulls is which direction they're pulling, right? So pi cap is a pull on water by the blood. Pi IF is a pull on water, but towards the interstitial fluid. So our pull from the capillary, right, is going the same direction here. Right, so this is a force for absorption. Oops. Keep my colors consistent. All right, so our two forces for absorption, I'll circle them in both of these diagrams. So we had the pressure of the interstitial fluid, which moves water from the interstitial fluid into the blood. But we also have, and that's a push kind of force. And then we had the pull from particulates in the blood, which pull water towards them. But these are going the same direction, and that direction is our absorption direction. So this is about the direction of the arrows. So this is towards blood, to blood. Okay, so our other two arrows are pointing the opposite way. They're going from the blood to this interstitial fluid. So that is our definition of filtration. So we'd add on our pi IF here. So that's a force for filtration, force for filtering out fluid from the blood, pulling it towards the tissues. Okay. So questions about this, because as we finish up with capillaries, we're going to continue thinking about these forces and we're going to be comparing them. Okay. So here is where we left off. So in addition to understanding the definition of these pressures, we also want to know something about their values, because we're thinking about sending blood from the arteriole into the capillary, then eventually going out the venule. And some of our forces are going to change as they move across the capillary. So specifically, we are going to see that the pressure, the hydrostatic pressure from the capillary, so P cap, maybe I'll just write that in here, right? So this is P cap that we're thinking about. So our pressure from the capillary changes from 38 at the arteriolar end to 16 at the venous end. Okay. Which means that if we're looking at the overall pressure for filtration versus absorption, right, what we do is we subtract the pressure interstitial fluid. So that's this 1. So this is our PIF. We'll see that we have a gradient in those hydrostatic pressures, those total net hydrostatic pressures from the arteriolar end to the venous end. So we have a much stronger force for filtration at the arteriolar end than at the venous end. Now, it is important that you understand why this is, that you understand the forces influencing this. But if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, step back and take an remember just what the purpose of the capillary is, right? So if we take a step back, we remember that our capillary's job is to bring nutrients from the blood, from the heart, to the tissue, and then to take away wastes. So we are going to see that overall, right, at the arteriolar end, that's the bringing end. Bringing is filtration, really. Bringing is filtration because it's moving stuff from the blood to the fluid, to that fluid surrounding the tissues. And then at the venous end, we'll see that that's the getting rid of waste end. So when we're looking at just the hydrostatic pressures, we can still see that there is some hydrostatic pressure overall for filtration here. But the difference we're going to see is that we also have to add in our osmotic pressure, so that pull from the proteins. So that's what we're going to add on next. But yeah, important to understand what these values mean, but if you start to get lost, pull back a second and think about the big picture of what the capillary's job is, and that should help you kind of get the general gist, and then you can add in these factors. Okay. So when we're thinking about the osmotic pressure, it's the oncotic osmotic pressure, which is referring to those proteins. So we'll sometimes refer to it as the colloid pressure as well. All those terms are, for our purposes, interchangeable here. It's the pull that those proteins are exerting on water because they can't get across that endothelial layer. So the capillary oncotic osmotic pressure, this pi cap, right? These can take a second to learn, which is why I just keep writing them in when we encounter them, right? So our pi cap is the capillary oncotic osmotic pressure. And this is favoring reabsorption because this is due to those proteins in the blood. I am going to tell you here, right? The thing that you're going to think of as changing across the extent of the capillary, that's really only the hydrostatic pressure. We're going to expect this to stay constant. So this is always going to be about 25 millimeters of mercury, unless we have more proteins or more particulates in the blood as a whole. But we're not going to see differences here in our osmotic pressures between the capillary, between the arteriolar end and the venual end. Okay. So same deal for the interstitial fluid. It's pretty constant. So the interstitial fluid, right? So pi IF, and we think of it as a pull, right? A pull towards the interstitial fluid, a pull towards the interstitial fluid. This is our definition of filtration. It's also constant, somewhere between 0 and 1. Okay. This means that if we look at the osmotic pressure gradient, comparing these two values, so comparing pi cap and pi IF, right? Because we want to figure out overall which direction the osmotic pressure is sending us, right? Because if we think about this from the perspective of an individual water molecule, it has to factor in all these pressures, but it can only go one direction physically in space. Okay, so the osmotic pressure overall here is 25 minus 1, favoring reabsorption because we have more capillary osmotic pressure. So they're like more proteins pulling water towards the blood here. yeah, for our purposes, absorption, reabsorption, consider those interchangeable. Sorry, got a question in the chat there. We'll talk a bit about the difference between absorption and reabsorption when we get to the kidneys. At that point, it'll be important. But right now, your book kind of oscillates between which term it uses. So for now, those are the same thing. So here's a drawing, slightly better than mine. Again, this is just showing us those forces that we've drawn out a couple times now. So our P is showing us hydrostatic pressures. So the direction of each of those, we have the push of the interstitial fluid from this interstitial space towards the blood. And we have the push of the fluid in the blood out towards the interstitial fluid. So this side on the left, those are hydrostatic pressures. And then on the right, we see our osmotic pressures from the particulates in the interstitial fluid exerting a pull on water, or the proteins in the blood exerting a pull on water towards the blood. All right, so the P is a push kind of force, the pi is a pull kind of force. So overall big picture, if we looked at the relative size of these arrows, right? So if we started to think about our comparison, right, of these forces on each end, what we're looking at here, this next picture is just showing us again this kind of more bird's eye view of the role of either end of the capillary, which is going to see that we have filtration at the arteriolar end and absorption at the venule end, right? Because that's the job, is to bring nutrients to the tissue and then take wastes away in that order. Great. We can also calculate these. So what we're talking about when we have that diagram with these big arrows, right, showing us filtration at the arteriolar end, absorption at the venule end, what we're talking about is the net filtration pressure at each of these locations. So the net filtration pressure is all those forces, so P cap, PIF, PIIF, pi cap, all put together, all those forces acting on any given water molecule. So in order to figure out the true direction that water molecule wants to go, we have to take all of this into account. So we have an equation for this, and it looks like this, basically. So first we take our pressures for filtration. So first we're adding up the pressures taking us from the blood to the interstitial fluid. And then we're subtracting the forces taking us from the interstitial fluid into the blood, which gives us our total net filtration pressure. All right. If you are memorizing this equation overall, like directly, just remember that you have to distribute this negative, right? Either do them in order, add these together, add these second parentheses together, and then do your subtraction, or distribute that minus sign over here as well. Hope you're not offended by my reminder about math, but I used to be a person who forgot negatives in my life. Okay, so that's our equation here. And so this is going to show us why we have the different situations at the arteriolar end and at the venous end, taking everything into account. So these numbers are substituted in as our actual numbers that we've talked about. So here is our pressure, our hydrostatic pressure from the capillaries, right? At the arteriolar end, it's about 38. And that's a force, right? The blood physically pushing out on those walls, right? Blood physically pushing out, okay? The other force for filtration, for this direction of arrow, is the pull from particles, those impermeant solutes, in the interstitial fluid. So it's a pull, but when we draw the arrow, we see that it's exerting a force, again, towards the interstitial fluid, which is filtration. We did say that this value for pi IF is between 0 and 1, so it doesn't add substantially. But if you start to think about pathologies or injuries, you may see differences in this. We'll talk about some things that can change the amount of solutes in this space, and that's why we have to remember that it's there, even though right now it's a 0. Okay, so pi IF is 0. And then we're subtracting our forces for absorption. Okay, so we have the pull exerted by our proteins in the blood. All right, so pull on water towards those particles. We're trying to water them down, right? So pi cap 25. And then the pressure, the physical pressure of the interstitial fluid pushing towards the blood. That's our pressure IF. Again, real small, but it could change, right, if we start to see swelling, if we start to see increases in the amount of interstitial fluid there. So if we do that equation overall, 38 plus 0 minus 25 plus 1, so minus 26, got 12 millimeters mercury for filtration. All right, so when we get a positive number here, we got a positive number. Actually, I'm going to clear my drawings for now because they're not super helpful at the moment. So positive number means that this first half of the equation, was higher than the second half. This first half of the equation is our filtration pressure. If we get a negative number, right, I got a negative number, this means that the second half of the equation was bigger, right? That's mathematically how we would get a negative, which means that the absorption pressure would be bigger than the filtration pressure, which means overall we'd see absorption. So overall we would actually see movement of water from the interstitial fluid into the blood. Now, we see that at the arteriolar end, in total, we have filtration. At the venous end, in total, we have absorption. So this is what's happening at kind of a micro level. If we do look at the capillary as a whole, total overall, right, we can see that there's 12 for filtration at the arteriolar end, and then 10 in the opposite direction for absorption at the venous end. Overall, for the capillary, we do see more, color to change, more filtration than absorption. So both are happening at once, but filtration, we are having more fluid filtered at the arteriolar end than we're having absorption at the venous end. So on net, we see 3 liters of fluid filtered a day. So you have like 20 liters go past your capillary, you have 3 more liters picked up by the body than you have removed. Now this would be a problem because you'd start swelling from holding onto all this water, but your lymphatic system does a handy thing, and I'll talk about lymphatics later. It's going to pick up excess filtrate and return it to the circulation. So you're not just totally overall having fluid move out of your blood and into your body on like a loop. It does eventually get returned, just not through the cardiovascular system. So going to move forward. We are going to review this at some point, and we'll practice doing that math as a review, probably on Friday, but maybe next week. Okay. So Here's just our equation again, the total filtration pressure, absorption pressure. Oh, this is actually the exact same slide, but we've circled this net portion, right? So this is telling us that our net activity of movement of fluid from the blood into the tissues is filtration. This is, we make up for it through the lymphatics. So, as you might expect with everything we talk about in this class, right, that's our kind of baseline, but we do have lots of factors that affect filtration and absorption, right? When we're thinking about physiology, we think about changes to these systems, right? Because we want to understand feedback loops, we want to understand regulation, and we want to understand pathology. Okay. So one really interesting factor that has an effect here is when you stand on your feet. This actually has a lot of effects on your cardiovascular system. So one thing that happens when you stand up from sitting, right, the gravity actually acts on the blood itself. So gravity kind of pulls your blood down. As it's pulling your blood down in that lower part of your body, you then have more blood. You have like higher blood pressure in those capillaries. So you have more blood, so you have more hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries themselves. So that's one thing that happens to you like every day that would change those values in the capillaries. So at that point, right, you have more PCAP, more pressure from the capillary pushing out towards the interstitial fluid. So you have fluid, that's a force for filtration. So you might see, right, like your feet swelling, right? Sometimes your feet swell if you've been on your feet all day, right? Partially because of this pressure change, this increase in filtration because of an increase in hydrostatic pressure. Other things we'll see are with injuries and diseases. So I want you to think about these for a second. So when you get injured, right? So say someone, I don't know, punches you, all right? Damages your capillaries, right? Now we have this nice fancy endothelial layer that's supposed to block things from passing between, but when we damage the capillaries, we'll see that they leak fluid and they leak proteins. So now when we're injured, we may end up with more proteins, right, in that interstitial fluid and not in the blood anymore. And additionally, a hormone we have acting in the case of injury, right, is going to increase the capillary permeability to proteins, right? So this is also going to allow those proteins to move from the blood to the interstitial fluid. So I'm going to take a second in your mind and think about how this is going to affect those equations for filtration versus absorption. Think about what pressure this is affecting. I'll pull it up. All right. So what we're doing when we increase proteins, right, we're increasing our proteins here in our interstitial fluid because we have an injury, right? And we got some leaking into this space. So we're increasing this pull of those proteins, right? That osmotic pressure is really a pull. So we're increasing the pull this way. So this is a force for filtration. Oh, sorry, this should not say causes more absorption, right? It's a force for filtration. We have an increase in it. It's causing more filtration. Okay. So this is why you see like swelling, right? I'm gonna scribble over that more. So this is why you would see some swelling around an injury, is because these proteins, they're pulling more fluid towards them. We're watering them down. Histamine is increasing the permeability to proteins, which also increases this swelling, basically. Okay. So then the other thing, right? Second example is liver disease, right? So if we think about liver disease, one of the things that liver disease can do is it can decrease the plasma proteins. All right. So when we have a decrease in plasma proteins, so we have fewer proteins in the blood, right? So here we're having a decrease in the pressure for the capillary, right? The osmotic pressure, that is. New diagram, right? So we're saying now we have fewer proteins here than we used to. So our original state, we had a kind of big pull towards those proteins, force for absorption. Now, at our second time point after liver disease, we're having less of a pull. So a decrease of a force for absorption, and this is written correctly, is going to cause more filtration overall, because those absorption forces are the ones that are fighting filtration, right? Our NFP is equivalent to filtration forces minus our absorption forces. So if this second number gets smaller, overall, our NFP will tilt towards filtration. So both of these examples are instances where we could see more filtration and more swelling, basically. Okay. We have lots of diseases that actually affect all of these sorts of pressures and pulls on these Starling forces in our capillaries. So kidney disease and heart disease both have effects here. So kidney disease has an effect on blood volume, because we'll see that the kidneys are really regulating how much water goes into our urine, essentially, so how much water you're losing. So something that kidney disease can do if that system isn't working properly, if you retain too much water, this increases blood volume. When you have an increase in blood volume, you have an increase in blood pressure, which we'll look at in some detail when we tains. Okay. At the same time, can also see a decrease in plasma proteins. So the plasma proteins are those ones in the blood. Okay. So overall, we're going to see this causes an increase in the pressure in the capillaries, right? The hydrostatic pressure, because of the increase in blood volume and blood pressure. So as we see an increase in this force for filtration, we're going to see more filtration, so like more swelling. Right? Oh, heart disease clicked on at the same time. So something that happens in heart disease, if your heart isn't working correctly, sometimes it's not going to expel the right amount of blood, right? And blood can basically get backed up. So that's part of what happens in pulmonary edema. So what's happening in pulmonary edema is we have blood backing up. We're going to get an increase in blood pressure in the veins, right? Because blood isn't getting into the heart. So we have it kind of building up, which also causes an increase in the pressure in the capillaries. In the case of pulmonary edema, we're talking specifically about those capillaries pretty close to the heart, so the ones in the respiratory system, in the lungs. The pressure in the capillary, that P cap, that hydrostatic pressure for the capillaries, is a force for filtration. When we increase this force for filtration, we're going to have more filtration, causes swelling, right? So swelling, another word for swelling in medicine is edema. So that's what pulmonary edema really is we have heart disease messing with the pressures in our cardiovascular system, which mess with the filtration of our capillaries, which ultimately causes swelling in the tissues. Congestive heart failure works the same as well. It's just the other side of the heart failing, basically, but it would also be an increase, basically, in filtration because of increases in pressure. So we're going to do a couple questions, and I'll put these up as polls as well. So I'm just going to highlight here. We're talking about more proteins in the interstitium. So the interstitium is that space, that interstitial space between the tissue and the blood. So here we're thinking about our interstitial fluid as having more proteins. Okay, take another second and I'll end this. Okay, so what you should have is the interstitial fluid osmotic pressure. So what we're saying, right, is we have our capillary, we have damage, we have a cut, right? So like now we have a gap here, proteins leak into the interstitial fluid, right? And that's the osmotic pressure, right? The interstitial fluid osmotic pressure, or pi IF, is pulling water towards those proteins, right? So we have more proteins, so it's increasing this interstitial fluid osmotic pressure. Okay, let's try another one. So we're looking for the one that is not one of these forces that we've been going over. So 3 of these are basic definitions of those forces we've been talking about: PCAP, PIF, PICAP, PIIF. One of these isn't one of our Starling forces, isn't affecting our absorption and filtration. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Okay, so most of you picked this. So the ionic driving force caused by ions in the blood. This isn't a force for absorption or for filtration in the capillaries. So when we looked at the structure of the capillaries, we actually saw that ions can kind of get through that endothelial layer. So they don't count as impermeant solutes for our osmotic pressure. Basically, if you were thinking about ions, hopefully you were thinking, oh, maybe that affects our osmotic pressures. It really doesn't. Really, when we're thinking about those osmotic pressures, we're thinking about the force exerted by proteins specifically. So I'm going to give you a second. We're going to do a very quick introduction to the venules and veins just to keep ourselves on track. Obviously, we're not getting through this whole packet in the next 4 minutes. So. Okay. So we'll talk about real quick, especially because we've seen the difference between arteries and veins in lab, right? There's some differences here in the anatomy. So our arteries, remember, are really thick-walled. They have a bunch of smooth muscle. We can physically see how they're thicker-walled and more elastic in the lab because that's part of how we've been telling whether we're looking at an artery or a vein, the thicker versus thinner wall. We also know that fundamentally the role of the veins and of the smaller venules is to bring blood back to the heart. So our blood flow goes oxygenated blood from the heart into the arteries, into the arterioles. Then we have our microcirculation in the capillaries. Arterioles and venules count as part of the microcirculation as well. So we have then our filtration happening at the first part of the capillary, absorption happening at the second part of the capillary, then that blood, which is now full of waste products and empty of oxygen, is going into the venule, into the vein. What we will notice is specifically different about veins in most of the body, excepting the central nervous system and the thorax, and we'll talk about that later on, is that veins are going to have valves. So you may not have seen these. We haven't really been opening veins in lab, but we're going to see that the veins in a large part of the body have valves. And those valves are going to work kind of like turnstiles, right? If you're going into, I don't know, like a subway or a building where they're being careful about crowd control, you have those turnstiles that go one way, but not the other way. Our veins are going to have valves that allow blood to flow one direction, but are not going to allow blood to flow back in the opposite direction. And that's going to be important as we look at how venous return to the heart happens throughout the body. So otherwise, these structures are similar to structures we've looked at before. So venules are small. They're actually a bit smaller than arterioles, right? They're connecting our capillaries to our veins. They have a little bit of smooth muscle, but not very much. So our arterioles, we were really focused on that smooth muscle because it's part of how we were regulating resistance. It's not really the job of a venule, so not very much smooth muscle. We'll see a little bit of exchange happening between the blood and the interstitial fluid still happening, right, as we're exiting the capillaries, but again, not very much. Difference in the vein is it's larger. They have large diameter, but they have super thin walls. Their valves are going to allow unidirectional blood flow, so those are those turnstiles. They're present in peripheral veins, so like out in your arm, out in your legs. Absent from central veins, so like absent in the thorax, and we'll see why that is. This is the last thing I want to touch on before we break for today. So the purpose of the veins is basically as a volume reservoir. So they're going to be holding a lot of blood. They're going to be keeping your blood volume up. And they're able to do this because they are highly compliant. So we touched briefly on compliance before, but I know it's a point that raises some confusion for people. So I basically want you to think of compliance as like how easy it is to hold volume. So it's really easy for the veins to hold a lot of blood. So easy, high compliance. The arteries, harder for them to hold a lot of blood, low compliance. Okay. And we'll look at a graph of that as well. But associate veins in your head, highly compliant, right? That won't steer you wrong. Highly compliant veins hold a lot of blood. The official definition of compliance does have to do with the relationship of volume to pressure. So if we wanted to define it specifically, we would say that they can expand with little change in pressure. If you think about it, that's kind of what you mean when you say easy, right? If it's easy for them to hold a lot of volume, means you don't have to expend a lot of force. They don't have a lot of forces building in them. So they expand, not much force, this little change in pressure. That's another way of defining easy. Okay, so they're functioning as a blood reservoir. They're going to hold 60% of our total blood volume at rest. Okay. So we're going to stop there and we'll think more about veins and how blood moves through them on Friday. Probably a good place to stop because we've been doing a bit of math today and we'll be doing some more understanding of pressure as it relates to veins on Friday. Okay, so have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.